I'm paper 21 now, thanks to Ian Morris and Jonathan Friedman, with 4 to go. And the disclaimer that a number of people have put forward in my case is that I'm here as a function of bait and switch. I was invited to come and be a discussant for Chris, and I figured that would be easy because I've been criticizing him for 35 years and I wouldn't have to think about it. In December, I got an email saying, we want you to do Incursions instead. And my response was one of those 3-letter, starts with a W and ends with an F. I haven't done Incursions in 15 years and I quit for a reason. And the reason why they wanted me to do it, I think, was because I once claimed that I would have a database for all incursions for all time that would be useful for a variety of things, and I decided that that was crazy, and I quit doing it. I quit collecting the data. But I do like Incursions, and I like Tom Hall. It's in part because I identify with the barbarians, and I hope that I usually want them to beat the center. 16 years ago, I found myself involuntarily climbing the Great Wall in China, involuntarily because the minder got confused and thought we didn't want to take the cable car up to the top and we wanted to climb it physically. So we spent an hour doing it. I got to the top, I was the first one up, and this clown who takes money from tourists came at me with a halberd just as I came over the wall. He had an antique uniform on, and my response was to take the halberd away from him. I started to do that. And I was trying to think, which wall was I going to throw him over, the far wall or this wall? Suddenly realized I must have done this before in an earlier life. And I quit doing it because in 2000 that would have been a rather unfortunate kind of thing to be caught doing. But I like the idea of climbing walls and taking away that kinds of things. All right, so the question is, what could I do in a week to satisfy this conference, because I've got 6 papers to write in 5 weeks during March and April. And so I came up with an idea, is that the thing about incursions, that and these are basically what people refer to as nomadic attacks on sedentary targets. They're not always nomads. Sometimes they're actually farmers that are doing it, but basically they're hinterland people attacking the center from time to time, and the question is whether they have significance and what kind of significance they might have. The extreme case is Joe Tainer's argument that these are convenient ghosts to explain collapse of societies that usually leave very little evidence, and therefore that's why they're convenient, and he just sort of dismisses them. And I think that's unfair to my favorite causal agent of barbarians. But the thing is that they're not so much critical for what they do as for what they represent. In other words, they do a lot of things, and they had superior military technology for a specific period of time, and they lost it, and they got defeated. But more importantly, it's why they were doing what they were doing, and the general pattern, I would suggest, is that they're responding to climate change. And one of the things that I wanted to do was pick up where I left off 15 years ago and link it to some arguments about climate change. So let me quickly, let's see, what do I do with this here? The basic pattern that we'll be talking about is not so much, well, it's basically a matter of rainfall and temperatures, cold and warmer, but it's a basic Eurasian machine, and we've been talking about leaving out Central Asia and what do we do with East and West and that sort of thing. I think that the solution is to take or adopt a more Eurasian perspective, and the climate perspective suggests that you have this machine that generates in a cyclical fashion changes in the ability and capabilities of people to operate in an agrarian environment for thousands of years in a very literal way. And it affects them differently in different parts of Eurasia. The farther you are away from the Gulf, For example, the monsoon rains are not going to reach, but that sets up a pattern of people that are more affected by the lack of grass, let's say, or access to water, moving towards places that are greener, which is the recurring phenomenon of these hinterland attacks. Where I left off 15 years ago or so was a model like this. Actually, it's a slightly different model, but the basic argument is that from political scientists, the kind of things I'm interested in are regime transitions, which are the rise and fall of different dynasties in different parts of the world, or empires. Hinterland incursions, I've already mentioned economic contractions, their pattern, and trade collapses. And the argument was that, in particular if you focus on the Near East, ancient Near East, that there is a repetitive pattern of almost at the end of every millennium, from the 4th millennium on to the 1st millennium BCE, of a combination or concatenation of all four of these things tending to happen at the same time. So where I left off was that I had coded centuries for the presence or absence of these kinds of things, and it turned out that you get these clusters that occur around 3100, around 2200, and around 12 or 1100, all BCE in the Near East. So I never was quite sure what to do with that and where to take it, and that was one of the reasons why I moved away from it. I read a book, it came out in 2014, that sparked my interest and has re-stimulated my interest in what you do with incursions. And that's the historian at Ohio State, Brooke, his book on the history of climate change. It's a very long book. It's written by a historian, and so you ghettoize all the data in these couple of pages so that they don't really get in the way of the narrative. And he doesn't really try and demonstrate that there's a relationship between the climate change he's talking about and the various things that happen, which leaves some opening for social scientists to come at it. But the nice thing about what he does is that he sticks his neck out and argues that there is a basic pattern, and this is only part of it. It goes back to 9000 BCE and goes up to 2000 CE. I'm getting the part that we're most interested in for sort of the ancient world moving into the medieval period. It has a binary schedule for good and bad climate. This is the good side, that's the bad side. This is the time period in which you either have less rainfall or it gets too warm. And in this more optimal periods, successive optimal periods, you have the opportunity to, particularly in the area that is most vulnerable to aridity around the Near East, but not also excluding other parts of Eurasia, all the way up to Siberia and parts of North Africa as well, that you have the most opportune setting for various kinds of things that happen, particularly in terms of the rise of new empires and their expansion. So my question is, what can I do with this kind of a simple, and you already saw with Philippe's earlier presentation, for 1,000 years he had a number of different long-term patterns of change that are very difficult to work with because it's hard to translate them directly into something as simple as a binary good or bad sort of thing. So my question is, to what extent are these time periods accurate, or reasonably accurate, in terms of predicting the kinds of things I'm interested in: incursions, regime transitions, and trade collapses? So what I do in the paper, and there are a lot of tables in the paper, paper's up, you can take a look at that. I'm not going to try and replicate them here because you're getting hungry and I don't want to get in the way of that. What I did in summary form is I looked at first Tagapera's old classical 1978 sample of empires. I never quite figured out why he chose those 20 empires, but my question is, how many of them experienced what he called failure in bad climate years? And the answer is 12 to 14, depending on whether you accept his particular dating. There are a couple you can quibble about. which is a good proportion of the sample. I then went to the various standard, and you all know that there are differences of opinion about the regime transitions in different parts of the world, but give or take, 20 years here and there, they're not too great of differences of opinion. I then did the same thing. I'm sorry. Back. I did the same thing for China, starting with the mythical Xia or Xia to all the way up through the most recent imperial effort, and about half of them ended in bad times. But when you get to the places that are even more likely to be influenced by bad weather, Egypt and Mesopotamia have a clear majority of ending of regimes during bad times. And the only exception to that is I found a series for Elam, which I'd never seen before, and it doesn't seem to fit all that well. I don't understand why it wouldn't be like Mesopotamia, but I throw it in just to show that I'm trying to be honest and not suppress that particular information. Then went to a city data. This is Medelski's urban compilation, and I aggregated the ancient cities and the classical cities, which have different thresholds, 10,000 for ancient, and then it goes up to 100,000. The basic tendency for the data to fluctuate conforms pretty much to the moving back and forth between good and bad climate, according to Brooke. And I just simply describe it there rather than trying to show you the series. In terms of incursions, now this is one thing that I didn't intervene in earlier. The incursions are not going to work the same way throughout Eurasia because they've got different kinds of configurations. In China, for example, you got the Pacific Ocean on one side that you don't have in, say, Mesopotamia, where in Mesopotamia you've got a desert on one side and you got mountains on another side, so you're going to get a different kind of pattern for incursions than you would in China, necessarily. Each one of these areas seems to go through an evolution, but that the general pattern of the evolution is that the incursions become more and more serious and gradually take over the system. Initially they start off in very episodic ways and gradually improve their ability to move in. But the patterns are slightly different and have different phases, as I've tried to suggest in this quick run-through. I mentioned a book that I don't see cited very often that I recommend on the Near East. It's Isar and Zohar, 2007. They have a fascinating book on climate change and a variety of different things. It starts off with that bridge, which represents basically northeastern Africa and the Near East, particularly around Egypt, that allows you to move from East Africa into the other parts of Eurasia. And their argument is that the bridge fluctuated in its ability to be transited through. And then when the weather was good, people stayed, and when it wasn't, they either couldn't transit through or they kept on going. And that if we understood the very first migrations of Homo sapiens sapiens, we would realize what role that particular area played. But basically, they've got 5,000 or more years of book devoted entirely to discussing climate change vis-a-vis a variety of different things like regime transitions and incursions. Some of these have been mentioned before. Indo-Europeans are active at least for 4,000 years in different parts of the world. And these are basically people that live north of the Black Sea and for a variety of reasons are stimulated to move towards Europe. They're stimulated to move towards India. They're stimulated to move towards the Middle East. They're stimulated to move towards China. And if we understood that pattern a little bit better, I try and lay it out in a table as to the extent that we know about it now, we would have a pretty good idea of a fairly important process that connects all of Eurasia, not just Central Asia, but all of it from both West and East. And then the barbarian invasion of Europe, I have another table on that. That starts off really 1000 BCE and goes on. Technically, you can stretch it up to 1500, 1600 CE. It's a long period of activity, starting in Scandinavia, moving down, and then having groups that are being pushed from Central Asia into Western Europe. And then it continues on with the Vikings and other kinds of activities with the Normans after the Vikings, which of course they're just transformed Vikings. And it continues on to the general Western European area. All right. Very quickly, basically what happens with incursions are that they interrupt trade in the short term. In the long term, they lead to reorientations of trade. So if you can't get, Europe can't get goods from Turkey and Iran, then they get it from the Gulf. And this kind of pattern goes on throughout the entire Eurasian world, ranging from China to the Mediterranean. When it gets blocked, they simply move in a different direction, and it becomes a bigger, more globalized kind of effort over the entire time period we're looking at. So I'll leave out the exogenous incursions insult to Chris, which is one of his assumptions. I think that, well, I decided to leave it out, so I'll leave it out. The final answer is that I think one solution for this is that if you go back to the embedded networks that we have, information on the outside moving into the goods and the political military, one possible idea is to talk about a meteorological interdependence that is the outer limit of the information network. That is, it's broader. The one thing that was overlooked, I think, in the simultaneity argument earlier is that there are causal agents at work, and that's what the incursions are. If it was just things happening simultaneously in different parts of Eurasia due to climate, that would be one thing. But what happens is that you have climate change that affects a large territory, and it affects it similarly and differently at the same time in different parts, which sets up movement of peoples towards other parts, so that you get some incursions are moving over 1,000 miles. You're getting people coming down from the Caucasus into the Near East, for example. They're moving all the way across Central Asia to the very limits of Greater China. That's and becomes an endogenous process to the extent that it goes on for some period of time. And so if you want to, I guess I'm back to the insult, if you want to consider it as exogenous, you got to frame it in terms of a time parameter, how long that's going to last before you accept it as a more general process. So the bottom line here is that I see a possibility, without going up to the shade of Ellsworth P. Huntington, of a general machine-like cyclical regularity to the movement of peoples that leads to all kinds of political, economic, and social turmoil that affects both the targets of incursions and the people that are carrying out the incursions. And we don't fully have a good feel for it, but if you take it all into calculation at one time, it's an entire Eurasian kind of phenomenon, and it becomes increasingly wider spread over time as you move from about 4,000 BCE to 1,000 CE. Okay, I'll stop there.